There exists a creature that walks the shadowy border between human and beast, a monster born not from evil alone, but from the darkest curse imaginable. When the full moon rises and bathes the earth in its silver light, something ancient awakens within certain souls, something that tears away humanity and replaces it with savage hunger. The werewolf has haunted our nightmares for thousands of years, lurking in forests and prowling through villages, leaving behind only terror and blood-stained memories. This is not merely a tale of monsters, but a journey through human fear itself, through the curse that transforms ordinary people into predators, through legends that have survived centuries because they touch something primal deep within us all. Tonight, we will walk through the entire story of the werewolf, from its earliest origins in ancient civilizations to the curse that binds man to beast, through the countless legends that have shaped cultures across the world. We will witness how this creature became the ultimate symbol of our own hidden savagery. The darkness we fear exists within ourselves. This is a story of transformation, of lost humanity, of the thin line between civilization and chaos. Prepare yourself for a journey into shadow, into moonlight, into the heart of one of humanity's oldest and most terrifying legends. Long before modern civilization rose from the dust of ancient empires, before cities stretched across continents and technology conquered darkness, humanity lived close to nature in ways we can barely imagine today. Our ancestors dwelled in small communities surrounded by vast wilderness, where predators ruled the night and survival meant respecting the power of the natural world. In those primitive times, people understood that they were not alone in the darkness, that something wild and dangerous moved through the forests beyond their firelight. The wolf was among the most feared of all creatures, a hunter that worked in packs, that possessed intelligence and cunning, that could bring down prey much larger than itself. Early humans watched these animals with a mixture of terror and fascination, recognizing in them a reflection of their own tribal nature, their own capacity for coordinated hunting and fierce loyalty to the pack. The wolf became more than just an animal in the human imagination. It became a symbol of wildness itself, of the untamed forces that existed beyond human control. In the flickering firelight of those ancient camps, storytellers began weaving tales that mixed the power of the wolf with the form of humans, creating something new and terrifying in the process. These early legends spoke of people who could transform into wolves, who possessed the strength and ferocity of the beast while retaining human cunning and intelligence. The concept was not simply about physical transformation but represented something deeper about human nature itself, about the savage instincts that civilization tried to suppress but could never fully eliminate. Different cultures developed their own versions of this creature independently, suggesting that the idea touched upon something universal in the human experience, some shared understanding of our dual nature as beings capable of both reason and violence. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh mentioned people who were rejected by the gods and forced to live as animals, wandering the wilderness in forms that were neither fully human nor fully beast. The ancient Greeks told stories that would lay the foundation for the werewolf legend as we know it today, tales that explained not just the existence of these creatures, but the curse that created them. The Greek legend of Lycaon stands as one of the earliest and most influential werewolf stories in recorded history, a tale that established many of the themes that would echo through werewolf lore for thousands of years to come. Lycaon was a king of Arcadia, a ruler who presided over a land known for its wild nature and its connection to the god Pan and other deities of the untamed world. According to the myth, Zeus came to visit Lycaon's kingdom in disguise, testing the hospitality and piety of mortals as the Greek gods often did in their stories. Lycaon, either doubting that his visitor was truly divine or seeking to test the god himself, committed an act of unspeakable horror. The king slaughtered a human being, possibly one of his own sons according to some versions of the tale, and served the flesh to Zeus as part of a meal, hiding the true nature of the dish and waiting to see if the god would notice. Zeus, being all-knowing and all-seeing, immediately recognized the terrible crime that had been committed in his presence. The god's rage was terrible and swift, and his punishment was both creative and eternal in its cruelty. Zeus transformed Lycaon into a wolf, stripping away his human form and forcing him to wear the shape of the beast whose savagery he had embraced through his cannibalistic act. The transformation was not merely physical but represented a fundamental change in Lycaon's very nature. a reduction from civilized king to wild animal, from ruler to outcast. Yet the curse was more complex than simple transformation, for Lycaon retained his human mind even as his body became that of a wolf, trapped in an animal form while his human consciousness remained intact, forever aware of what he had lost. This detail would become crucial to later werewolf legends, this idea that the transformed human maintains some level of awareness during their bestial state, that they can remember their actions even if they cannot control them. The name Lycaon would give us the term lycanthropy, the clinical and mythological word for the transformation from human to wolf, a word that carries within it the memory of that ancient king and his terrible punishment. The story established a pattern that would repeat throughout werewolf legends across cultures. The transformation as punishment for transgressing sacred boundaries, the loss of humanity as consequence for embracing inhumane actions, the wolf form as external manifestation of internal savagery. The ancient Romans inherited Greek mythology and adapted it to their own cultural needs, spreading the werewolf legend throughout their vast empire as they conquered territories across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Roman authors wrote about lycanthropy with a mixture of skepticism and superstitious belief, acknowledging that educated people dismissed such tales while common folk still feared them greatly. Pliny the Elder, the famous Roman natural historian, wrote about werewolves in his encyclopedic work on the natural world, describing the belief that certain families in Arcadia had members who would transform into wolves for a period of years before returning to human form. Pliny himself expressed doubt about these stories, yet he recorded them carefully, preserving the details for future generations and showing that even skeptics found the legend compelling enough to document. Other Roman writers told stories of soldiers encountering werewolves in the forests beyond civilization's borders, tales that reflected Roman anxieties about the wild Germanic and Celtic tribes they fought against, about the savage world that existed beyond the ordered Roman realm. These stories served a cultural purpose, reinforcing the division between civilized Romans and barbarian others, between the light of Roman law and the darkness of the untamed wilderness. As the Roman Empire expanded northward into the forests of Europe, Roman ideas about werewolves encountered the existing beliefs of Celtic, Germanic, and Norse peoples, creating a rich mixture of traditions that would shape European werewolf legends for centuries to come. The Norse had their own traditions of warriors who wore wolf pelts and entered battle frenzies that made them fight with inhuman strength and ferocity, men known as Ulfhednir who were believed to take on wolf characteristics during combat. These were not exactly werewolves in the cursed sense but represented a related concept, the idea that humans could access animal power through ritual and spiritual means, that the boundary between human and beast was more permeable than civilized society wanted to admit. Germanic tribes told stories of people born with the ability to transform, of families that carried wolf blood in their veins, passing this trait down through generations like a terrible inheritance. Celtic legends spoke of people cursed by druids or transformed by magical means, of individuals who wore wolf skins that bonded to their bodies and could never be removed, trapping them forever in a state between human and animal. These very traditions would blend together over centuries, creating the complex tapestry of werewolf lore that would dominate European imagination during the medieval period. The fall of Rome and the rise of Christianity brought new dimensions to werewolf legends, as the Church sought to explain these pagan stories within a Christian framework while also using them to teach moral lessons to newly converted populations. Christian theologians debated whether physical transformation was actually possible or whether lycanthropy was a delusion sent by Satan to torment people's minds, whether werewolves were real creatures or metaphors for spiritual corruption. St. Augustine, one of the most influential early Christian thinkers, wrote that while God could certainly allow such transformations if he wished, they were more likely tricks of demons who made people believe they had changed form when no actual physical change had occurred. This explanation allowed Christianity to acknowledge the widespread belief in werewolves while maintaining theological consistency about the nature of reality and divine power. Yet regardless of whether the Church taught that werewolves were physically real or demonic illusions, the result was the same. These creatures became associated with Satan and his works, with sin and damnation, with the eternal struggle between good and evil that formed the backbone of medieval Christian worldview. The concept of the werewolf curse became central to European legends during the medieval period, transforming the creature from simply another supernatural being into something more tragic and terrible. The curse represented a fundamental loss of control over one's own body and actions, a nightmare scenario where the victim became a prisoner within their own transformed flesh. Medieval stories emphasized that most werewolves had not chosen their fate but had been cursed by witches, attacked by other werewolves, or punished by God for sins they had committed. This distinction was crucial because it created sympathy for the werewolf even while emphasizing the horror of their existence, making them simultaneously monster and victim, predator and prey. The curse typically activated during the full moon, that bright silver disk in the night sky that seemed to exert mysterious power over the natural world, causing tides to rise and fall, affecting the behavior of animals, and according to legend, triggering the transformation of cursed individuals into savage beasts. The physical transformation itself was described in gruesome detail in medieval texts and folklore, a process of excruciating pain and bodily corruption that reflected the curse's violation of natural law. The victim would feel the change beginning as the moon rose, starting as an itch beneath the skin that rapidly became burning agony as bones began to shift and reshape themselves. The spine would curve and contort, forcing the body to bend forward into a hunched posture as the skeletal structure rearranged itself to support four-legged locomotion rather than upright human stance. Fingers would elongate and twist as nails thickened and sharpened into claws capable of tearing through flesh and rending meat from bone. The face would push forward as the skull reformed, the nose and mouth extending into a snout filled with fangs designed for killing and consuming prey. Hair would sprout across the entire body, thick coarse fur that covered the transformed flesh in a pelt that could be gray, black, brown, or in rare cases even white. The eyes would change color, often becoming yellow or amber, glowing with inhuman intelligence and predatory hunger. The entire process might take minutes or hours depending on the version of the legend, but it was always described as intensely painful, a torture that the victim endured month after month whenever the full moon rose. Once the transformation was complete, the human mind was said to be either completely submerged beneath animal instinct or trapped as a horrified observer of the beast's actions, unable to control the body or prevent the violence it would commit. The transformed werewolf possessed strength far beyond what either human or natural wolf could muster, able to tear apart doors, break through walls, and overpower multiple armed men with savage fury. The creature's speed was supernatural, allowing it to run down prey that would easily outdistance a normal human, to move through forests with the sure-footed grace of a true wolf despite its larger size and semi-human form. The senses of the werewolf were heightened to incredible levels, with hearing that could detect heartbeats from great distances, vision that penetrated the darkness of night as clearly as humans saw in daylight, and most importantly a sense of smell that could track prey across miles, following scent trails invisible to human perception. This combination of human intelligence and animal instinct, of supernatural strength and enhanced senses, made the werewolf one of the most dangerous predators imaginable, a creature perfectly designed for hunting human prey. The werewolf's hunger was always emphasized in the legends, described not as normal appetite but as an overwhelming compulsion that drove all other thoughts from the mind. The beast craved meat, preferably fresh-killed and torn from still warm bodies, and it showed particular preference for human flesh according to many stories. This detail added to the horror because it meant that werewolves specifically targeted people rather than animals, that they hunted in villages and towns rather than remaining in the wilderness where natural wolves belonged. The creature would kill livestock when human prey was unavailable, leaving behind scenes of tremendous carnage, animals torn apart with a violence that exceeded any need for food, suggesting that the werewolf killed not just to eat but from some deeper savage impulse. Farmers would find their flocks decimated, sheep and cattle ripped open and partially devoured, with tracks in the blood-soaked earth that looked almost human but not quite, prints that suggested something walking on two legs occasionally but mostly moving on four. These attacks caused economic devastation to medieval communities where livestock represented wealth and survival, where losing animals to a predator could mean starvation during the winter months. Far worse than the attacks on livestock were the assaults on people themselves. The tales of werewolves stalking human victims through moonlit nights and leaving behind mutilated corpses that terrified entire regions. Medieval chronicles record numerous accounts of werewolf attacks, written in the matter-of-fact tone of historical documentation rather than obvious fiction, suggesting that people truly believed these events had occurred. Children vanishing while playing near forests, their torn bodies found days later. Travelers attacked on lonely roads, their screams heard by people who remained safely behind locked doors, too frightened to investigate until morning light revealed the carnage. Women gathering firewood or men checking trap lines who never returned home, with search parties finding only bloodstains and strange tracks. These stories spread fear through communities and created a culture of suspicion where neighbors watched each other for signs of the curse, where anyone who acted strangely or was absent during full moon nights might fall under suspicion of being a werewolf. The curse was said to spread through a bite from another werewolf, creating a chain of infection that could theoretically turn entire populations into monsters if left unchecked. This concept of transmission through biting linked werewolf legends to rabies, that terrible disease spread by animal bites that caused victims to become violent and hydrophobic, to foam at the mouth and attack others in mindless rage before dying in agony. Medieval people observed rabid wolves attacking humans and other animals without normal predatory caution, behaving in ways that seemed almost supernatural, and this likely contributed to werewolf beliefs. The idea that a human bitten by a werewolf would themselves become cursed added urgency to hunting down these creatures, because every werewolf represented not just a single threat but the potential origin point for an outbreak of lycanthropy. Some legends claimed that the curse could be passed through other means as well: drinking water from a wolf's footprint, sleeping under the full moon in certain cursed locations, wearing a belt made from wolf skin, or being born on Christmas Eve in some Eastern European traditions. These varied methods of transmission reflected local folklore and cultural beliefs, but they all emphasized that lycanthropy could strike anyone, that no one was truly safe from the curse. Breaking the curse became a central concern in werewolf legends, with various proposed cures and remedies that reflected both folk medicine and religious belief. Some stories claimed that calling the werewolf by their true human name 3 times while they were transformed would break the spell and restore their human form permanently. Others said that causing the werewolf to shed 3 drops of blood would end the curse, leading to tales of brave individuals who wounded the beast just enough to draw blood before it fled back into the night. Christian traditions often emphasized prayer and exorcism as potential cures, with priests performing rituals to drive out the demonic influence that supposedly caused the transformation. Holy water, blessed objects, and prayers to specific saints were all believed to have power over werewolves, though stories disagreed about whether these methods would cure the curse or merely repel the creature temporarily. More permanent solutions required recognizing the werewolf in human form and addressing the curse before the next transformation. A dangerous task because werewolves were said to be extremely cunning about hiding their true nature during daylight hours when they wore human skin. The tragic element of the werewolf curse reached its peak in stories about people who desperately tried to resist their transformations, who chained themselves in cellars or locked themselves in rooms to prevent their beast form from harming loved ones. These tales emphasized the horror of losing control over one's own body and will, of becoming a danger to the very people one most wanted to protect. Fathers who feared they might kill their children, husbands who locked themselves away from wives, young people who withdrew from their communities as they felt the curse taking hold. Some legends told of werewolves who retained enough human consciousness during transformation to feel grief and horror at their own actions, who remembered every moment of violence they committed and carried that burden of guilt even though they could not prevent their cursed nature from emerging with each full moon. This psychological torment was in some ways worse than the physical transformation, creating monsters who were victims of their own existence, trapped in an endless cycle of transformation, violence, and remorse that could only end in death. Medieval Europe became the heartland of werewolf legends, with stories spreading across the continent and taking on distinctive characteristics in different regions while maintaining core elements that made them recognizable as part of the same tradition. France in particular developed an extensive werewolf folklore, with the French term loup-garou becoming synonymous with the creature in regions where French influence was strong. French legends often emphasized the tragic romantic aspects of lycanthropy, telling stories of knights cursed to wolf form who retained their noble nature despite their bestial appearance, or of lovers separated by the curse with one partner desperately seeking to free the other from their monthly transformation. The medieval French romance of Besclavret, written by the poet Marie de France in the 12th century, told the story of a baron who transformed into a wolf and was betrayed by his wife, who hid his clothing so he could not resume human form, then married another man believing her first husband gone forever. This tale added new elements to werewolf lore, particularly the idea that werewolves needed to remove their clothing before transforming and required access to those same garments to return to human shape. a detail that appears in many subsequent stories. Germanic regions developed their own rich werewolf traditions that often connected lycanthropy to ancient pagan practices and warrior cults, creating a mythology where becoming a wolf was sometimes seen as a source of power rather than purely a curse. The medieval German epic poem of the Volsunga saga contains stories of fathers and sons who found magical wolf pelts in the forest and wore them, becoming trapped in wolf form for days until they could remove the skins, during which time they committed murders and created chaos. These were not involuntary transformations triggered by the moon but deliberate choices that nonetheless trapped the wearers in beast form longer than they intended, suggesting that seeking wolf power was inherently dangerous and corrupting. German folklore also told of women called Hexen who could transform themselves into wolves through witchcraft, who would gather in forests during certain nights and run as a pack, terrorizing the countryside before returning to human form and their ordinary lives. This connection between werewolves and witchcraft would become increasingly important during the witch-hunting period, when accusations of lycanthropy became tangled with accusations of serving Satan and practicing forbidden magic. The Baltic regions and Eastern Europe developed particularly dark werewolf traditions, with Lithuanian, Latvian, Polish, and Russian folklore containing numerous tales of these creatures and the threats they posed. Russian legends spoke of people cursed by evil sorcerers or transformed through deals with dark powers, of werewolves that formed packs and attacked entire villages in coordinated assaults that seemed almost military in their organization. Baltic folklore told of werewolves who could be recognized in human form by specific physical characteristics such as eyebrows that met in the middle, unusually hairy palms, curved fingernails resembling claws, or an odd gait as if their legs were slightly bent even when walking upright. These identifying marks created paranoia in communities because they meant that werewolves could be walking among people undetected, living as neighbors and friends while harboring a monstrous secret. Eastern European stories often emphasized that werewolves could not fully die even when killed, that their spirits remained active and dangerous, requiring specific burial practices to keep them from rising again or continuing to curse the living from beyond the grave. The Scandinavian countries contributed their own unique elements to werewolf mythology, drawing on Viking traditions and Norse paganism to create stories where the line between werewolf and shapeshifter became blurred. Norwegian and Swedish legends told of berserkers who fought in wolf form, of families that carried the ability to transform through their bloodlines as both gift and curse, of people who could send out their spirits in wolf shape while their human bodies lay sleeping and vulnerable. Icelandic sagas contained numerous references to people with the ability to take wolf form, sometimes portraying this as a magical talent rather than a curse, something that could be controlled and used deliberately rather than an involuntary monthly transformation. Danish folklore included stories of people cursed to spend years as wolves before being allowed to resume human form, if they survived that long, creating a sense that lycanthropy could be temporary rather than permanent, but that the ordeal of living as a beast for extended periods would fundamentally change a person even after they regained human shape. These Nordic traditions influenced how werewolf legends developed in other parts of Europe as Vikings raided and settled across the continent, bringing their stories with them and blending them with local folklore. The British Isles developed complex werewolf traditions despite having no native wolf populations in recorded history, showing how powerful the legend had become independent of actual wolf encounters. English folklore spoke of werewolves as creatures found in other lands rather than in England itself, but stories circulated nonetheless about cursed individuals and about the transformation as a metaphor for moral corruption and savage behavior. Welsh mythology included tales of transformation and shape-shifting that shared elements with werewolf legends, of people who could take animal forms through magic or divine intervention. Scottish Highland folklore told of people who wore wolf pelts obtained through forbidden means and could not remove them, becoming trapped between human and beast. Irish legends spoke less frequently of werewolves specifically but had numerous stories of people transformed into animals through curses or fairy magic, creating a cultural context where the idea of human-to-wolf transformation fit naturally into existing beliefs about the permeable boundary between human and animal, natural and supernatural. The term werewolf itself came from Old English, with wer meaning man and wolf needing no translation, showing that English-speaking peoples had the concept embedded in their language, even if they placed the stories in distant lands. The medieval period saw werewolf beliefs become entangled with Christian theology in complex ways that both reinforced and complicated the legends. The Church taught that Satan could not actually change one form into another because transformation was a power reserved for God alone, Yet the reality of demonic influence meant that people could believe themselves transformed and act accordingly, or that demons could create illusions making people appear to be wolves when they remained human underneath. This theological position allowed church authorities to acknowledge widespread belief in werewolves while maintaining that true physical transformation was impossible, that what people interpreted as lycanthropy was actually demonic possession or mental illness sent by Satan to torment souls and lead them into sin. Yet this distinction between actual and illusory transformation made little practical difference to people who encountered what they believed to be werewolves, because an illusion that could kill was just as dangerous as a real transformation, and a person possessed by demons who believed themselves a wolf and acted accordingly was no less threatening than someone whose body had actually changed. The Church's ambiguous position on werewolves reflected its broader struggle to incorporate pagan beliefs into Christian framework without fully endorsing supernatural ideas that competed with Christian doctrine. Monastic chronicles from medieval Europe contain numerous accounts of werewolf encounters written by monks and church officials, recorded as historical facts rather than folklore or legends. These chronicles described attacks on pilgrims traveling to holy sites, on monks working in monastery fields, on villagers living near forests where werewolves were said to dwell. The matter-of-fact tone of these accounts suggests that the writers genuinely believed they were recording real events, not composing fiction or entertainment. Some chronicles included details about werewolf hunts organized by local nobility, about creatures tracked to their lairs and killed, about bodies found that had been partially transformed between human and wolf shape when death caught them mid-change. Whether these accounts recorded actual events involving diseased wolves or disturbed humans, genuine belief in supernatural transformation, or simply repeated folklore that had been accepted as fact, they demonstrate that educated medieval people took werewolf threats seriously enough to document them alongside wars, famines, and other historical events. The inclusion of werewolf accounts in official chronicles gave the legends authority and legitimacy, making them part of the historical record rather than merely folk stories passed down orally. Beyond the involuntary curse, medieval and early modern folklore also described deliberate methods for transforming oneself into a wolf, dangerous rituals practiced by those seeking power or driven by desperation or corrupted by evil influence. These transformation rituals were said to be taught by witches or discovered in forbidden grimoires, ancient books of black magic that contained knowledge humans were never meant to possess. The rituals varied by region and tradition, but they shared common elements that emphasized the transgressive nature of deliberately seeking to become a beast, the violation of natural and divine law that such transformation represented. These were not accidents or punishments but conscious choices to embrace the wolf form, and the legends treated such choices as grave sins that would inevitably damn the practitioner's soul even if the transformation itself could be reversed. One widespread tradition held that transformation could be achieved through wearing a belt made from wolf skin, particularly skin taken from a wolf that had been killed in a specific ritual manner. The belt had to be crafted during certain phases of the moon, treated with herbs and oils whose recipes were passed down through hidden channels, and consecrated through words spoken in languages that predated Christianity's arrival in Europe. Once created, the belt would bond to its wearer when fastened around the waist, and removing it would become increasingly difficult as its power took hold. Some stories claimed that the belt eventually fused to the wearer's body, growing into the flesh until it could never be removed, trapping the person permanently in a state where they could shift between human and wolf form but could never be fully one or the other. The belt method appeared in numerous werewolf trials during the witch-hunting period, with accused lycanthropes confessing under torture that they had obtained such belts from Satan or his servants, that wearing these cursed objects had given them the power to terrorize their communities while in wolf form. Another transformation method involved magical ointments or salves rubbed into the skin, potions whose ingredients were said to include wolf fat, herbs gathered at midnight, and other substances too terrible to name in polite company. Medieval and Renaissance texts on witchcraft and dark magic included recipes for these ointments, warning readers about their dangers while paradoxically preserving the formulas for future generations. The ointment was typically applied to the entire body while speaking specific incantations, with the transformation beginning as the potion soaked into the skin and entered the bloodstream. Some accounts claimed these ointments contained hallucinogenic compounds that made users believe they had transformed and caused them to act out wolf-like behaviors while actually remaining human, suggesting that some werewolf legends might have roots in drug-induced psychosis rather than supernatural transformation. Yet other accounts insisted that the ointments created genuine physical change, that observers witnessed the transformation with their own eyes and could testify that the person had truly become a beast. Certain locations were believed to facilitate transformation, places where the boundary between human and animal became thin enough to cross deliberately. These included ancient stone circles predating Christianity, burial mounds of pagan chiefs, crossroads where suicides had been buried in unhallowed ground, and clearings deep in forests where moonlight fell in particular patterns. A person seeking transformation would travel to such a location during the full moon, remove all clothing to symbolize shedding civilized humanity, and perform a ritual that might involve dancing in circles, calling upon forbidden names, or making offerings to old gods whose worship was officially forbidden but never completely forgotten. The transformation that occurred at these sites was said to be voluntary and temporary, lasting only for the night unless the ritual was repeated or unless the person remained too long in wolf form and forgot their human nature, becoming trapped as a beast forever. These location-based transformations appeared frequently in folklore from Celtic and Germanic regions, where ancient pagan sites remained visible in the landscape, where people still remembered old gods and old ways despite centuries of Christian teaching. The most disturbing transformation rituals involved cannibalism, echoing the original Greek legend of Lycaon and his punishment for serving human flesh to Zeus. These traditions claimed that eating human meat would trigger a transformation or make a person vulnerable to the werewolf curse, that the act of cannibalism itself was so transgressive that it broke the boundary between human and beast. Secret societies were rumored to exist where members consumed human flesh in ritual contexts, believing this would grant them the power to transform into wolves and other predatory animals. The connection between cannibalism and transformation appeared in multiple cultural contexts, suggesting that it tapped into deep-seated fears about what separates humans from animals, about how thin the veneer of civilization really is, about what might happen if people deliberately crossed certain forbidden lines. The horror of these stories lay not just in the transformation itself but in the willing choice to commit such terrible acts in pursuit of bestial power. Some traditions held that transformation could be inherited, passed down through family bloodlines like hair color or height, creating dynasties of werewolves where children had no choice but to accept the curse carried in their very blood. These hereditary werewolves might not even be aware of their nature until puberty or some other trigger activated their ability to transform, creating tragic stories of young people who suddenly discovered they were monsters. The hereditary element added complexity to werewolf lore because it meant the curse could not always be traced to a specific sinful act or demonic pact, that innocent people could be born with this terrible fate through no fault of their own. Families that carried the werewolf curse might try to hide this fact, arranging marriages carefully to avoid passing the trait to new generations, or they might accept it as part of their heritage and teach younger members how to control the transformation or at least minimize the harm they caused while in beast form. The concept of werewolf bloodlines would later influence literature and popular culture significantly, creating a mythology of werewolf clans and dynasties that existed hidden within normal human society. The voluntary transformation rituals were considered even more sinful than being cursed into lycanthropy through no choice of one's own, because they represented a deliberate rejection of humanity and an embrace of bestial nature. Church authorities condemned these rituals as witchcraft and devil worship, as explicit contracts with Satan that traded the practitioner's immortal soul for temporary earthly power. The people who deliberately transformed were viewed not as victims deserving sympathy, but as willing servants of evil who had chosen to become monsters. This moral distinction became important during the werewolf trials that would sweep across Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries, because it affected how accused werewolves were treated by authorities and what punishments were considered appropriate. Someone cursed against their will might be seen as deserving pity even while they were killed to protect the community. But someone who had deliberately sought transformation deserved no mercy and would face the harshest penalties that law and church could devise. The 16th and 17th centuries witnessed a wave of werewolf trials across Europe, particularly in France, Germany, and Switzerland, where hundreds of people were accused of lycanthropy, tried in courts of law, and executed if found guilty. These trials occurred during the same period as the more famous witch trials and were closely connected to them, with accusations of werewolfism often accompanying charges of witchcraft and devil worship. The trials reflected deep anxieties in early modern European society about disorder and evil, about Satan's power and influence in the world, about the need to identify and eliminate threats to Christian order. The testimonies and confessions from these trials, many extracted through torture, provide a window into how people actually believed lycanthropy worked, what they thought werewolves could do, and how communities tried to protect themselves from these perceived threats. The trials also reveal the tragic human cost of supernatural beliefs, as innocent people were executed based on superstition, forced confessions, and the certainty of judges who believed they were fighting literal monsters. The trial of Peter Stubbs stands as one of the most famous and disturbing werewolf cases in history, a German trial from 1599 that resulted in one of the most brutal executions ever recorded. Stubb was accused of practicing black magic for 25 years, of having received a magical belt from the devil that allowed him to transform into a wolf, and of committing numerous murders while in beast form. The charges against him included killing and eating 14 children, 2 pregnant women, and engaging in other acts too horrible to be described in detail even by the standards of an age accustomed to violence. Stubb was also accused of incest with his daughter, and of having a female demon as his mistress, charges that connected his alleged lycanthropy to broader sexual and moral crimes. Under torture on the rack, Stubb confessed to all charges, providing detailed descriptions of his transformations and his crimes that perfectly matched what his interrogators expected to hear. His confession described how he would remove his belt to become a wolf, how he gained tremendous strength and lost all human mercy in that form, how he hunted and killed without remorse before returning to human shape and resuming his normal life. The execution of Peter Stubb was designed to be as terrible as his alleged crimes, a public spectacle meant to demonstrate what happened to those who made pacts with Satan and transformed into beasts. Stubb was fastened to a wheel and his flesh was torn from his body with red-hot pincers in 10 different places, a process that took hours and was calculated to cause maximum suffering. His arms and legs were then broken with repeated blows from a wooden axe or hammer, shattering the bones that had allegedly carried him on his murderous hunts. After this prolonged torture, Stubb was finally beheaded, and his body was burned on a pyre so that nothing remained that could be used for dark magic or become the focus of any cult. His daughter and mistress, accused of complicity in his crimes, were strangled and burned alongside him. As a final warning to others who might consider similar sins, authorities erected a pole displaying the torture wheel topped with a wooden cutout of a wolf and Stubbs' severed head, a grim monument that stood for years afterward reminding passers-by of the fate awaiting werewolves and their associates. A pamphlet describing Stubbs' crimes and execution was published and widely distributed across Europe, spreading the story and reinforcing beliefs about the reality of werewolves and the need for harsh measures against them. In France, the trial of the Gondelin family in 1598 resulted in multiple executions for lycanthropy and witchcraft, demonstrating how werewolf accusations could destroy entire families. The case began when a young girl was attacked by something that witnesses described as a large wolf, though some claimed they saw it had human-like hands rather than paws. When men from the village pursued the creature, they claimed it transformed into a woman named Perinette Gondelin, who had a reputation locally as being strange and possibly practicing witchcraft. Perinette was killed by the mob before she could be taken to trial, torn apart by men who believed they were fighting a werewolf. Authorities arrested her brother Pierre and her sister and another brother, subjecting all of them to interrogation and torture. Under this pressure, they confessed to being werewolves who transformed using a magical ointment, to attending witches' sabbaths where they worshipped the devil, and to killing and eating children while in wolf form. All 3 were convicted and burned alive, with the court records stating that they had been proven to be both werewolves and witches, that their confessions were credible and their guilt beyond question. Another French case, the trial of Jacques Roulet in 1598, resulted in a rare outcome where the accused werewolf was not executed but instead sent to an asylum, reflecting some skepticism among educated authorities about the literal truth of lycanthropy. Roulet was a beggar found near the mutilated body of a 15-year-old boy, with blood on his hands and clothes and no reasonable explanation for his presence at the scene. When questioned, Roulet claimed that he could transform into a wolf using an ointment, that he had killed the boy while hunting in wolf form with 2 companions who were also werewolves. His confession was confused and contradictory, and when examined by authorities, Roulet appeared to be intellectually disabled or mentally ill rather than a calculating servant of Satan. The local court initially sentenced him to death, but when the case was appealed to the Parliament of Paris, higher authorities reduced his sentence to 2 years in a madhouse for treatment of his insanity. This outcome suggested that some officials in the late 16th century were beginning to view werewolf confessions as symptoms of mental illness rather than evidence of actual supernatural transformation, though such skepticism remained the exception rather than the rule, and many other accused werewolves would continue to be executed. The trial of Jean Grenier in 1603 provided another case where youth and apparent mental illness led to a sentence of imprisonment rather than execution, though the boy's confessions provided disturbing details that became part of werewolf lore. Grenier was a 13-year-old beggar who told multiple people that he was a werewolf, that he had killed and eaten several children while in wolf form, that he preferred the taste of young girls to boys and had hunted them specifically. He claimed to have received a wolf skin and an ointment from a man called the Lord of the Forest, who was actually the devil, and that wearing the skin allowed him to transform. Several children testified that they had been attacked by a wolf-like creature that they believed was Jean Grenier transformed, though they had escaped before being seriously injured. Medical experts examined Grenier and testified that he was mentally deficient, that his teeth were abnormally pointed, that his nails were long and claw-like, and that he moved in a strange manner. The court concluded that Grenier genuinely believed he was a werewolf, but that this belief stemmed from mental illness and perhaps demonic influence rather than actual physical transformation. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in a monastery where monks would attempt to cure his delusions through prayer and religious instruction. Reports indicate that Grenier continued to insist he was a werewolf throughout his incarceration, that he walked on all fours when possible, that he tried to attack and bite other people, and that he died at age 20 still believing himself to be a beast trapped in partially human form. German territories saw numerous werewolf trials, with the proceedings documented in detail by local courts that viewed lycanthropy as a serious crime requiring thorough investigation and harsh punishment. The town of Bedburg saw several trials beyond the famous Peterstub case, with other individuals accused of transforming into wolves and terrorizing the surrounding countryside. In areas where livestock attacks occurred frequently, where children disappeared or travelers were found dead under suspicious circumstances, communities often concluded that a werewolf must be responsible and pressure would mount to identify and punish the culprit. The identification of suspected werewolves often relied on questionable evidence such as wounds on a person's body that matched injuries inflicted on a wolf seen in the area, the person's absence from home during times when werewolf attacks occurred, or simply their reputation for oddness or antisocial behavior. Once accused, defendants faced interrogation techniques that often included torture, which predictably produced confessions that confirmed what interrogators wanted to hear about pacts with Satan, magical transformation, and terrible crimes committed in beast form. The werewolf trials gradually declined as the 17th century progressed, and the 18th century brought new intellectual movements that questioned supernatural beliefs. The Enlightenment emphasis on reason and empirical evidence made educated people increasingly skeptical of claims about physical transformation from human to wolf, though belief persisted among common folk in rural areas. Medical authorities began classifying lycanthropy as a form of mental illness, a delusion where patients believed themselves to be animals and acted accordingly but experienced no actual physical change. This medicalization of lycanthropy helped end the trials and executions, as people who claimed to be werewolves were now seen as needing treatment rather than punishment, as patients rather than criminals. Yet the cultural impact of the trial period lasted far beyond the trials themselves, embedding the werewolf firmly in European consciousness as a figure of terror and tragedy, as a reminder of the thin line between civilization and savagery, between human and beast. While European werewolf legends are the most famous in Western culture, beliefs about humans transforming into dangerous predatory animals exist in cultures throughout the world, suggesting that this concept taps into something universal in human psychology and experience. Each culture developed its own version of the shapeshifter legend based on the predators in their local environment and their specific cultural fears and values. In Africa, numerous cultures told stories of people who could transform into lions, leopards, hyenas, or crocodiles, creatures that posed real threats to human communities and whose behavior could seem almost supernaturally cunning and dangerous. These African shapeshifter traditions paralleled European werewolf beliefs in many ways while incorporating distinct cultural elements that reflected African spiritual beliefs and social structures. The shapeshifters were often said to be witches or sorcerers who transformed deliberately to attack their enemies or terrorize communities, using their animal forms to avoid detection and escape justice. West African cultures developed complex beliefs about leopard men, secret societies whose members allegedly possessed the ability to transform into leopards, or to take on leopard spirits that guided their actions. These leopard societies were said to conduct ritual murders, wearing leopard skins and using claw-like weapons to kill victims in ways that mimicked leopard attacks, creating terror and maintaining power through fear. Whether these societies actually believed in supernatural transformation or were criminal organizations using shapeshifter beliefs as cover for their activities remains debated, but the legends served similar social functions to European werewolf stories, expressing fears about secret evil lurking within communities and about the permeability of the boundary between human and animal. Colonial authorities documented numerous cases of suspected leopard men, conducting trials that echoed the earlier European werewolf trials, showing how these beliefs persisted even as Western influence spread across Africa. In East Africa, beliefs about wer-hyenas were particularly strong, with the hyena being feared not just as a scavenger but as a creature associated with witchcraft and evil spirits. Ethiopian and Somalian folklore told of people who could transform into hyenas at night, who would dig up graves to consume the dead or attack sleeping people in their homes. The hyena's eerie laugh, its ability to crush bones with powerful jaws, and its habit of targeting the vulnerable made it a perfect vehicle for shapeshifter legends. Blacksmiths and other craftspeople were often suspected of being wer-hyenas in some Ethiopian communities, creating social stigma that paralleled European suspicions about people who lived at the margins of society. The wer-hyena legends served to enforce social norms and explain misfortunes just as European werewolf stories did, showing how similar narrative structures emerged independently in different cultural contexts to address common human concerns about hidden evil and the violation of community trust. Asian cultures developed their own shapeshifter traditions that sometimes involved wolf-like creatures but more often featured other animals significant to local ecosystems and mythologies. In India, legends told of wer-tigers in regions where tigers were the dominant predators, of people who could take tiger form through magic or curse, who would terrorize villages just as European werewolves did. Japanese folklore included stories of humans transformed into animals through the influence of spirits or supernatural powers, though foxes and tanuki raccoon dogs were more common than wolves in these tales. Chinese mythology contained references to shapeshifters and to people possessed by animal spirits, though these stories often had different moral implications than European werewolf legends, sometimes portraying the transformation as granting wisdom or power rather than purely representing a curse or descent into savagery. The diversity of Asian shapeshifter traditions demonstrates that while the basic concept of human-animal transformation appears across cultures, the specific meanings and values attached to such transformation vary greatly depending on cultural context and local wildlife. Native American cultures across North and South America had extensive traditions of shapeshifting that long predated European contact, with stories of people transforming into wolves, bears, eagles, and other powerful animals. These transformations were often portrayed quite differently than in European werewolf legends, sometimes being seen as gifts rather than curses, as abilities that shamans and medicine people possessed and used for the benefit of their communities. The skinwalker traditions of Navajo and other southwestern tribes represented a darker interpretation, telling of witches who wore animal pelts to transform and used their powers to harm others, creating fear similar to that inspired by European werewolves. These skinwalker legends were and remain subjects that many native people are reluctant to discuss with outsiders, considered dangerous knowledge that should not be spread casually. The variety of Native American shapeshifter traditions, from positive shamanic transformation to evil skinwalker witchcraft, shows the complexity of human-animal transformation themes and how different cultural values shape whether such transformation is viewed as blessing or curse. In Central and South America, jaguar transformation stories were common in regions where jaguars were the apex predators, with Aztec and Maya traditions including wer-jaguar figures that combined human and feline characteristics. These wer-jaguars appeared in art and mythology as powerful beings, sometimes divine or semi-divine, other times representing humans who had gained the ability to transform through ritual or hereditary gift. The jaguar's role as a night hunter, its strength and stealth, and its importance in religious symbolism made it a natural focus for shapeshifter legends. Some traditions held that shamans could transform into jaguars to travel through spiritual realms, to protect their communities from supernatural threats, or to hunt with enhanced senses and abilities. These transformations were often portrayed as controlled and purposeful, rather than the uncontrollable curse of European werewolf legends, reflecting different cultural attitudes about the relationship between humans and animals, between civilization and wilderness. The Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime stories included accounts of ancestral beings who could shift between human and animal forms, who created the landscape and established the laws that would govern future generations. While these were not werewolf legends in the European sense, they reflected similar themes about the fluid boundary between human and animal, about the power and danger of transformation, about the consequences of violating natural and social laws. The Dreamtime beings might take animal forms to accomplish specific tasks or might be fundamentally creatures of dual nature, simultaneously human and animal, suggesting that this duality existed at the foundation of reality itself. The Aboriginal concept of totem animals and the spiritual connection between specific human groups and animal species created a framework where human-animal transformation was part of the natural order rather than an aberration or curse, showing yet another way that cultures conceptualize the relationship between human and beast. The global distribution of shapeshifter legends suggests that humans across all cultures have grappled with similar questions about their own nature, about what separates them from animals, about what would happen if that separation broke down. The werewolf in its specific European form represents just one cultural manifestation of this broader human fascination with transformation and the boundary between civilization and savagery. The prevalence of these stories across disparate cultures with no historical contact indicates that they emerge from common aspects of human psychology and experience rather than being purely the product of cultural transmission. Whether the predator in question is a wolf, leopard, tiger, or jaguar, whether the transformation is curse or gift, whether it is controlled or uncontrollable, the basic concept of humans crossing the boundary into animal form appears again and again, suggesting it addresses fundamental human concerns about identity, nature, and the darkness that might lurk within civilized exterior. As the Age of Enlightenment progressed and scientific thinking became more dominant in European intellectual circles, scholars and medical professionals began seeking rational explanations for werewolf legends rather than accepting supernatural transformation as literal truth. This shift reflected broader changes in how educated people understood the natural world, moving away from magical thinking toward empirical investigation and materialist explanations for phenomena that previous generations had attributed to divine or demonic powers. The medical condition that came to be called lycanthropy, where patients believed themselves to be wolves or other animals, provided one explanation for at least some historical werewolf reports. This condition, now classified as a form of delusional disorder or as a symptom of other psychiatric illnesses, causes affected individuals to genuinely believe they are transforming or have transformed into animals, to act out animal behaviors, and sometimes to become violent or dangerous in ways consistent with their delusional identity. Medical case studies from the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries documented individuals suffering from clinical lycanthropy, describing patients who walked on all fours, howled like wolves, attempted to bite others, claimed to be growing fur and transforming, and exhibited other behaviors suggesting they believed themselves to be wolves despite no actual physical transformation occurring. These cases demonstrated that the human mind could create powerful delusions about transformation and identity, that people could become so convinced of their animal nature that they behaved accordingly despite all evidence to the contrary. The causes of such delusions varied, with some cases appearing connected to schizophrenia, others to severe depression with psychotic features, still others to drug use or neurological damage affecting the parts of the brain responsible for body image and self-identity. Understanding that the mind could malfunction in ways that produced werewolf-like symptoms provided a naturalistic explanation for at least some historical werewolf accounts, particularly cases like Jean Grenier where the accused exhibited clear signs of mental illness alongside their claims of transformation. Rabies emerged as another scientific explanation for werewolf legends, with medical historians noting the striking parallels between rabies symptoms and traditional werewolf characteristics. Rabies is transmitted through the bite of infected animals, with wolves being among the species that can carry and spread the disease, creating an immediate connection to werewolf transmission through biting. The disease attacks the nervous system, causing victims to become increasingly agitated, violent, and deranged as it progresses, exhibiting the kind of uncontrolled savagery attributed to werewolves. Rabies patients develop hydrophobia, becoming unable to swallow and producing excessive saliva that foams around the mouth, an effect that matches descriptions of werewolves slavering and drooling as they hunt. The disease causes extreme sensitivity to light and sound, leading sufferers to avoid daylight and become more active at night, just as werewolves were said to prowl under moonlight and hide during day. Some rabies victims exhibit hypersexuality or aggressive biting behavior toward others, attempting to spread the disease in ways that parallel legends about werewolves creating more of their kind through biting. Before the development of the rabies vaccine in the late 19th century, the disease was invariably fatal once symptoms appeared, and its spread through wolf and dog populations in Europe could have inspired or reinforced werewolf beliefs. Ergot poisoning offered yet another possible naturalistic explanation for some werewolf reports and confessions, particularly those involving claims of transformation through consumption of ointments or potions. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, and when consumed in contaminated bread or other food products, it produces powerful hallucinogenic and toxic effects. Historical outbreaks of ergotism, known as St. Anthony's Fire, caused mass hysteria, hallucinations, convulsions, and psychotic episodes in affected communities. People suffering from ergot poisoning might genuinely believe they were transforming into animals, might experience vivid hallucinations of sprouting fur or changing shape, might behave violently while under the influence of the toxin's effects on their nervous systems. Some of the ointments and potions described in witchcraft and werewolf texts may have contained ergot or other hallucinogenic substances, meaning that people who used these preparations might have experienced drug-induced hallucinations of transformation rather than any actual physical change. This explanation could account for cases where accused werewolves genuinely believed they had transformed and could describe the experience in detail while witnesses insisted no transformation had occurred, a discrepancy that confused earlier investigators but makes perfect sense if the transformation existed only in the affected person's mind. Hypertrichosis, a rare genetic condition causing excessive hair growth across the body and face, provided a possible explanation for individuals who became associated with werewolf legends due to their appearance rather than their behavior. People born with hypertrichosis might be covered in thick hair that gave them an animal-like appearance, leading to social stigma, fear, and accusations of being werewolves or having werewolf ancestry. Historical accounts exist of individuals with this condition being displayed as curiosities, being persecuted as monsters, or being incorporated into werewolf folklore as examples of partially transformed individuals or of families carrying werewolf blood. The condition affects only a tiny percentage of the population, but those few cases could have had disproportionate influence on werewolf beliefs by providing visible evidence that seemed to confirm the possibility of human-animal hybrids. Other medical conditions affecting hair growth, skin appearance, and physical development might similarly have contributed to werewolf legends by creating individuals whose appearance deviated enough from normal human presentation to inspire supernatural explanations. Porphyria, a group of rare blood disorders that cause sensitivity to sunlight, changes in skin pigmentation, and sometimes psychiatric symptoms, has been proposed by some medical historians as a possible basis for vampire and werewolf legends. Certain types of porphyria can cause teeth and nails to appear reddish, create skin lesions that worsen in sunlight, and produce neurological effects including hallucinations and erratic behavior. Severe cases might lead sufferers to avoid daylight and exhibit behaviors that could be misinterpreted as supernatural transformation or curse. While the porphyria explanation for werewolf and vampire legends has been criticized as overstating the condition's actual symptoms and prevalence, it represents the kind of medical detective work that scientists and historians have undertaken to find naturalistic explanations for supernatural legends, to bridge the gap between medieval belief and modern understanding. The psychological concept of the shadow self, developed by Carl Jung and other depth psychologists, offered a metaphorical interpretation of werewolf legends as expressions of the repressed savage instincts that civilization forces humans to suppress. In this view, the werewolf represents the dark side of human nature, the violent and bestial impulses that society teaches people to control but that never fully disappear, that lurk beneath civilized behavior waiting for an opportunity to emerge. The transformation into a wolf symbolizes what happens when these repressed impulses break free, when the careful control that maintains civilized behavior fails and the beast within is unleashed. This psychological interpretation does not require belief in literal physical transformation but treats werewolf legends as a cultural framework for understanding and expressing anxieties about human nature, about the constant struggle between civilized and savage impulses, about the fear that we are not as far removed from animal behavior as we like to believe. The werewolf, in this reading, is a projection of the human shadow onto an external monster, a way of confronting uncomfortable truths about human capacity for violence and savagery by embodying those capacities in a creature that is both human and not human, both self and other. The 19th century witnessed the transformation of werewolf legends from folk belief into literary theme, as Gothic and Romantic authors discovered the dramatic potential of lycanthropy for exploring human nature and creating compelling horror narratives. These writers approached werewolf stories not as accounts of actual events, but as fictional tales that used the transformation motif to examine philosophical and psychological questions about identity, civilization, and the beast within. The shift from belief to literature marked a significant change in how Western culture engaged with werewolf legends, as the werewolf became primarily a character in stories rather than a threat people genuinely feared encountering in physical reality. Yet this literary evolution ensured that werewolf legends would continue to influence culture and imagination long after educated people stopped believing in literal transformation, giving the werewolf a new kind of immortality in the realm of fiction. The Romantic movement's fascination with nature, with wild places and untamed forces, created fertile ground for werewolf stories that portrayed the transformation as simultaneously terrifying and alluring, as a return to natural authenticity that civilization had suppressed. Romantic authors often portrayed their werewolf characters with a degree of sympathy, as tragic figures trapped between human and animal worlds, belonging fully to neither, suffering from their dual nature rather than being simply evil monsters deserving destruction. This sympathetic portrayal marked a shift from earlier folk traditions where werewolves were almost always antagonists, threats to be eliminated. The romantic werewolf might still be dangerous, might still kill innocents while transformed, but the tragedy lay in the curse itself rather than in any inherent evil in the afflicted person. This created more complex narratives where readers or audiences might actually identify with the werewolf character, might understand their perspective and suffering even while recognizing the danger they posed. Gothic horror writers incorporated werewolf themes into their explorations of the dark side of human nature, using transformation as a metaphor for the violence and savagery that lurked beneath Victorian propriety and civilized manners. The Gothic werewolf story often focused on respectable members of society, on gentlemen or nobles who harbored terrible secrets, who transformed into beasts when night fell and propriety no longer restrained them. This created powerful narratives about hypocrisy and hidden nature, about the gap between public presentation and private reality, themes that resonated with Victorian anxieties about maintaining appearances while dealing with desires and impulses that society deemed unacceptable. The transformation sequence became a key element of literary werewolf stories, described in vivid detail that emphasized both the physical horror and the psychological torment of losing human form and consciousness. European literature produced numerous werewolf stories during the 19th century, with French, German, and English authors all contributing to the genre. Some stories portrayed werewolves as villains, as creatures that must be hunted down and destroyed to protect innocent people. Others took the tragic approach, focusing on the suffering of the werewolf who might be a sympathetic protagonist struggling against their curse, desperately seeking a cure or at least trying to minimize the harm they caused during their transformations. Still others used the werewolf as a vehicle for social commentary, for criticizing aspects of society or exploring philosophical questions about human nature and morality. The variety of approaches demonstrated the flexibility of the werewolf motif, its ability to serve different narrative purposes depending on what themes the author wanted to explore. Guy Endor's novel The Werewolf of Paris, published in 1933, represented a peak of literary werewolf fiction, crafting a complex narrative that blended horror with historical fiction and psychological insight. The novel followed a werewolf living in Paris during the politically turbulent period leading up to the Franco-Prussian War and the Paris Commune, using the werewolf story as a lens through which to examine human violence, both individual and collective. Endor drew explicit parallels between the werewolf's bestial transformations and the mass violence of war and revolution, suggesting that the savage impulses unleashed by the werewolf curse existed in all humans and needed only the right circumstances to be released on a societal scale. The novel treated lycanthropy with psychological sophistication, exploring how the werewolf character understood his own nature, how he tried to control or come to terms with his transformations, how he related to other people who discovered his secret. The Werewolf of Paris influenced subsequent werewolf fiction significantly, establishing conventions and themes that later authors would adopt and adapt. Poetry also embraced werewolf themes, with various poets using the transformation as a powerful image for exploring questions of identity, nature, and the relationship between human and animal. Romantic and Victorian poets particularly found the werewolf motif useful for expressing ideas about the wild self that civilization suppressed, about the allure of abandoning social constraints and returning to a more natural state of being. The werewolf in poetry often appeared as a figure of freedom as much as of horror, as something that had escaped the confines of civilized life even at great cost. This poetic treatment added layers of meaning to werewolf legends, showing how the image could be interpreted in multiple ways depending on the author's perspective and intentions. Short stories provided another important venue for werewolf fiction, with the short form allowing authors to focus intensely on a single transformation event, or on a compact narrative arc that built tension toward a reveal or a final confrontation. Horror magazines and collections published numerous werewolf stories throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with each author adding their own variations to the werewolf legend while working within an increasingly established set of conventions about how these creatures behaved and how they could be defeated. The accumulation of these stories gradually built a shared cultural understanding of werewolves in literature, a set of common elements that audiences expected, and that authors could either fulfill or deliberately subvert for effect. The literary werewolf had become a distinct entity, related to but separate from the folkloric werewolf of earlier centuries, a character that existed primarily in the realm of fiction and entertainment rather than belief. The 20th century brought werewolves to cinema, where visual special effects could create transformation sequences more vivid and horrifying than any written description or oral tale. Film allowed audiences to witness the transformation itself, to see flesh ripple and bones crack, to watch for sprout and faces elongate into snouts filled with fangs. The visual medium proved perfect for werewolf stories, capturing the physical horror of transformation in ways that engaged viewers directly and created images that would haunt their memories long after the film ended. Early werewolf films were often crude by later standards, with simple makeup effects and unconvincing wolf costumes, but they established the potential of cinema for bringing werewolf legends to life on screen. As special effects technology advanced, transformation sequences became increasingly elaborate and realistic, becoming showcases for makeup artists and effects teams to demonstrate their skills in creating horrifying and believable monsters. The Wolfman, released by Universal Pictures in 1941, became the most influential werewolf film of the early sound era, starring Lon Chaney Jr. in a role that would define his career and would establish many conventions that subsequent werewolf movies would follow. The film told the story of Larry Talbot, who returns to his ancestral home in Wales and is bitten by a werewolf while trying to protect a young woman from attack. Talbot becomes cursed himself, transforming into the Wolfman during full moon nights and killing people before returning to human form with no memory of his actions. The film established the sympathetic werewolf protagonist, the tragic figure who becomes a monster against his will and suffers tremendous guilt over the murders he commits in beast form. Chaney's performance conveyed this inner torment effectively, making Talbot a character audiences could sympathize with even as they recoiled from the monster he became. The makeup effects by Jack Pierce, showing Talbot's transformation through a series of dissolves that gradually added more hair and changed his facial features, represented cutting-edge work for the time and created an iconic look that influenced how werewolves would be portrayed in visual media for decades. The Wolfman also introduced several elements to werewolf lore that did not come from traditional folklore, but would become widely accepted as part of werewolf mythology through the film's influence. The movie featured a poem that became famous, speaking of the werewolf as a creature that prowls when the wolfbane blooms and the moon is full and bright, establishing a clear connection between lunar cycles and transformation that became standard in later werewolf fiction despite being less prominent in actual folklore. The film also established silver as the one substance that could kill a werewolf permanently, having the character be finally killed with a silver-headed cane wielded by his father. This idea of silver as the specific weakness of werewolves became deeply embedded in popular culture, appearing in countless subsequent werewolf stories even though it had limited presence in traditional legends. The Wolfman's influence demonstrates how a single successful film can reshape and standardize a folklore tradition, creating new elements that become accepted as authentic parts of the legend through sheer cultural saturation. The Hammer Films werewolf movies, produced in Britain during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, brought gothic atmosphere and technicolor horror to werewolf cinema, creating films that emphasized both the beauty and the brutality of lycanthropy. Hammer's The Curse of the Werewolf from 1961, starring Oliver Reed, presented an elaborately detailed origin story for its werewolf protagonist, and explored the transformation as both curse and metaphor for repressed desire. The film suggested that the werewolf curse could be controlled through love and emotional stability, but that passion and violence could trigger transformations outside the normal lunar cycle, adding psychological complexity to the condition. Hammer's distinctive visual style, with rich colors, dramatic lighting, and elaborate period settings, created werewolf films that were as visually beautiful as they were horrifying, elevating the genre beyond simple monster movies into something approaching art. An American Werewolf in London, released in 1981 and directed by John Landis, revolutionized werewolf cinema with its groundbreaking transformation sequence created by makeup artist Rick Baker. The transformation scene showed the change from human to wolf in excruciating detail, as a continuous process rather than through dissolves or cutaways, using sophisticated practical effects to show bones breaking and reforming, skin stretching and tearing, the body contorting in ways that looked genuinely painful and horrifying. The sequence lasted several minutes and was shown in bright light rather than shadow, demonstrating the effects team's confidence in their work and creating imagery that audiences found both fascinating and disturbing. Baker's work earned the first-ever Academy Award for Best Makeup, establishing a new standard for transformation effects in horror cinema. Beyond its technical achievements, An American Werewolf in London also succeeded in blending horror with dark humor, creating a tone that was simultaneously frightening and entertaining, tragic and absurdist. The film's protagonist David Kessler was another sympathetic werewolf, a normal young man cursed through an attack, who suffered not only from his transformations but from visions of his victims urging him to commit suicide to end his killing spree. This psychological torment added depth to the monster movie framework. The 1980s and 90s saw numerous werewolf films exploring different approaches to the legend, from straight horror to action to attempts at more serious psychological drama. The Howling franchise, beginning with Joe Dante's original film in 1981, created a complex mythology around werewolf colonies and societies, imagining communities of lycanthropes living secretly among humans. Teen Wolf in 1985 took a comedy approach, portraying lycanthropy as a genetic trait that gave the protagonist advantages in sports and popularity rather than making him a dangerous monster, showing how flexible the werewolf concept had become in popular culture. Wolf, released in 1994 and starring Jack Nicholson, presented a corporate werewolf story where the transformation gave a middle-aged publishing executive renewed vitality and aggression that helped him compete in the cutthroat business world. Using lycanthropy as a metaphor for reclaiming masculine power and primal instincts that civilized life had suppressed. Each of these films added something to the evolving cultural understanding of werewolves, showing the continuing fascination with transformation themes and the flexibility of the werewolf concept to adapt to different genres and messages. The 21st century brought new technological capabilities to werewolf cinema through computer-generated imagery, allowing transformation sequences and werewolf action scenes that would have been impossible with practical effects alone. The Underworld franchise, beginning in 2003, reimagined werewolves as one faction in an eternal war with vampires, creating an elaborate mythology and portraying lycanthropes as powerful warriors rather than cursed victims. The Twilight series, adapted from Stephenie Meyer's novels, reinterpreted werewolf legends for young adult audiences, presenting werewolves as Native American shapeshifters who defended their community from vampire threats, who could control their transformations and retain their human consciousness while in wolf form. While traditional werewolf fans criticized these interpretations as departing too far from established lore, they demonstrated the continuing evolution of werewolf mythology and its ability to be adapted for new audiences and purposes. The visual capabilities of modern cinema allowed these films to show massive wolves and spectacular transformation effects that earlier filmmakers could only dream of achieving, though some purists argued that practical effects created a visceral impact that CGI struggled to match. Contemporary culture has fully embraced werewolves as fixtures of popular entertainment and mythology, with the creatures appearing across all media forms from television series to video games to comic books to role-playing games. This cultural saturation has created a modern werewolf mythology that draws on traditional folklore while incorporating elements invented by authors and filmmakers over the past 2 centuries. The modern werewolf exists in a complex web of stories and interpretations, with different versions emphasizing different aspects of the legend depending on the needs of the particular narrative. Some portrayals stay close to the traditional cursed monster, the savage beast that cannot control its transformations and kills innocently during full moon nights. Others present werewolves as a species or subspecies of human, with their lycanthropy being a natural part of their biology rather than a supernatural curse, allowing for werewolf characters who live their entire lives with this trait and may even take pride in it rather than viewing it as an affliction. Television has produced numerous werewolf characters and storylines, with some series making lycanthropy a central theme, while others include werewolves as part of larger supernatural ensemble casts. Teen Wolf, revived as a television series in 2011, reimagined the concept for a new generation, presenting werewolves as part of a complex supernatural ecosystem including various other creatures from mythology and folklore. The series explored themes of identity, belonging, and control, using lycanthropy as a metaphor for the transformations and loss of control associated with adolescence and young adulthood. Buffy the Vampire Slayer featured a recurring werewolf character who transformed 3 nights per month during full moon periods, retaining no memory of his actions while transformed, creating ongoing storylines about managing his condition and the danger he posed to friends and loved ones. True Blood included werewolves as part of its supernatural community, presenting them as having their own culture and politics distinct from both humans and vampires. These television portrayals exposed large audiences to werewolf mythology and contributed to the continuing evolution of how these creatures are understood and depicted in popular culture. Urban fantasy literature has created elaborate werewolf mythologies, often presenting lycanthropy as a kind of supernatural infection that creates werewolf communities with their own rules, territories, and hierarchies. These books frequently explore werewolf pack dynamics, drawing on what is known about actual wolf behavior while adding supernatural and human elements to create complex social structures. The idea of the pack alpha, the dominant werewolf who leads and controls others of their kind, has become standard in modern werewolf fiction even though it represents a simplification of actual wolf social behavior and has limited basis in traditional folklore. Many urban fantasy series present werewolves as one supernatural faction among many, coexisting with vampires, witches, demons, and other creatures in hidden communities that normal humans remain unaware of. These stories often include elaborate rules about werewolf society, about how packs are formed and maintained, about what happens when werewolves violate the laws of their kind, creating detailed world-building that treats lycanthropy as a fact of existence rather than simply a plot device. Romance fiction has discovered werewolves as attractive protagonists, particularly in the paranormal romance subgenre where supernatural beings become love interests for human or supernatural partners. These stories often emphasize the passionate nature of werewolves, their strong emotions and intense loyalty, their protective instincts toward their mates or chosen partners. The werewolf in paranormal romance is typically portrayed as powerful and dangerous but capable of controlling their beast nature for the right person, creating tension between the threat they represent and their role as romantic partner and protector. The enormous success of paranormal romance has brought werewolf stories to audiences who might not typically read horror or supernatural fiction, particularly to female readers who find the combination of danger and devotion appealing in werewolf romantic heroes. This has significantly expanded the cultural presence of werewolves and has influenced how they are portrayed even in non-romantic contexts, adding elements of sensuality and emotional intensity that were less prominent in earlier horror-focused werewolf fiction. Video games have embraced werewolves as both antagonists and playable characters, with transformation mechanics offering interesting gameplay possibilities. Games allow players to experience lycanthropy from the inside, to trigger transformations that grant enhanced strength and abilities, while potentially limiting control or carrying consequences. The Elder Scrolls series includes lycanthropy as a condition players can contract, gaining the ability to transform into a powerful beast form while also attracting hostility from certain factions and needing to manage the curse's effects. The Werewolf, the Apocalypse role-playing game, part of the World of Darkness franchise, reimagines werewolves as warriors fighting to protect the natural world against forces of corruption and entropy, creating a mythology where lycanthropy is a spiritual calling rather than a curse, where werewolves are heroes rather than monsters. This particular interpretation has influenced how many gamers and fantasy fans understand werewolves, adding ecological and spiritual dimensions to werewolf mythology that have limited presence in traditional folklore but resonate with modern environmental concerns. Comic books and graphic novels have produced memorable werewolf characters and stories, with the visual medium allowing for spectacular transformation sequences and dynamic action scenes showcasing werewolf powers. Marvel Comics has featured various werewolf characters over the decades, most notably Jack Russell in Werewolf by Night, who inherited his lycanthropy from a family curse and struggled to control his transformations while using his powers to fight supernatural threats. DC Comics has included werewolves in various storylines, sometimes as villains but occasionally as heroes or anti-heroes trying to use their curse for good. Independent and alternative comics have explored werewolf themes in more experimental ways, using the transformation motif to examine questions of identity, gender, and the relationship between civilization and nature. The visual nature of comics makes them particularly well-suited to werewolf stories, allowing artists to depict the transformation process and the werewolf form itself in ways that can be more detailed and horrifying than film effects while requiring less suspension of disbelief than prose descriptions. The internet age has created new venues for werewolf mythology to evolve, with online communities dedicated to discussing, creating, and sharing werewolf stories and lore. Fan fiction websites host thousands of werewolf stories, with authors creating their own interpretations of lycanthropy and werewolf society, building on or departing from established fictional universes. Online role-playing games and virtual worlds allow people to assume werewolf identities and explore what that might mean in a safe fictional context. Discussion forums debate fine points of werewolf lore, arguing about whether silver really should kill werewolves or whether that is just a modern invention, about what controls transformations and whether werewolves retain human consciousness in beast form, about how werewolf biology and reproduction might work if lycanthropy were real. These online communities keep werewolf mythology alive and actively evolving, ensuring that new generations will continue adding to and reinterpreting the legends that have fascinated humans for thousands of years. The enduring power of werewolf legends across cultures and centuries suggests that these stories address something fundamental about human nature and human concerns, that the werewolf serves as more than simple monster but functions as a powerful symbol carrying multiple layers of meaning. The most obvious interpretation sees the werewolf as representing the beast within civilized humans, the savage impulses and violent desires that society teaches people to suppress but that never fully disappear. Civilization requires constant self-control, constant restraint of impulses that would disrupt social harmony if freely expressed. The werewolf transformation represents what happens when that control fails, when the beast breaks free and wreaks havoc before civilized consciousness can be restored. This makes the werewolf a nightmare figure that embodies fears about our own capacity for violence and savagery, about how close we might be to losing the thin veneer of civilization that separates humans from animals. The connection between werewolves and the moon creates another layer of symbolic meaning, linking transformation to natural cycles beyond human control. The moon has been associated with madness and chaos in multiple cultural traditions, with the word lunacy itself deriving from luna, the moon. The idea that the full moon triggers transformation suggests that humans are subject to forces beyond their will or understanding, that nature retains power over us despite our attempts to separate ourselves from the natural world through civilization and technology. The werewolf cannot resist the call of the full moon, cannot maintain human form when that bright silver disk rises in the night sky, making lycanthropy a reminder that humans remain part of nature despite our pretensions of transcendence. This resonates with modern environmental concerns about humanity's relationship with the natural world, about the consequences of pretending we are separate from rather than part of ecological systems. The werewolf also functions as a symbol of the outsider, the person who cannot fully belong to human society because of some fundamental difference that sets them apart. Werewolves must hide their true nature from others, must live with a secret that would make them targets for fear and violence if discovered. They exist between worlds, fully belonging to neither human nor animal realms, unable to be wholly themselves in any context. This makes the werewolf a powerful metaphor for anyone who feels alienated from dominant society, who possesses some characteristic or nature that must be hidden or suppressed to avoid persecution. Various marginalized groups have found resonance in werewolf stories for this reason, seeing in the curse a reflection of their own experiences of being forced to hide their authentic selves, while among people who would reject or harm them if the truth were known. The transformation itself carries symbolic weight beyond just the curse or the beast nature, representing any fundamental change in identity that a person might experience. The violent, painful nature of the transformation in most depictions suggests that significant change is traumatic and destructive, that shedding one form to assume another requires tearing away what existed before. The temporary nature of the werewolf transformation in most versions of the legend, with the human returning to normal after the night of hunting, creates a different dynamic than permanent transformation would, suggesting that we contain multiple selves that emerge at different times rather than having a single fixed identity. The inability to remember actions taken while transformed, common in many werewolf stories, adds complexity by creating a divided consciousness where the same individual exists in two states that have no access to each other's experiences or memories. This resonates with psychological concepts about dissociation and the fragmentation of identity under trauma or stress. The curse aspect of lycanthropy carries meaning about guilt, punishment, and the inability to escape consequences of past actions. Werewolves in traditional stories often became cursed because they committed some sin or transgression, making their condition a form of justice even as it inspires sympathy. The curse cannot be easily broken and continues month after month, year after year, making it a punishment that persists long past any initial crime and that inflicts ongoing suffering disproportionate to the original offense. This creates questions about the nature of justice and redemption, about whether people defined by their worst moment deserve endless punishment or whether they should be allowed the possibility of change and forgiveness. The werewolf who kills innocently while transformed despite their human self being horrified by these actions creates moral complexity about responsibility and culpability, about whether we can be held accountable for actions taken when not in full control of ourselves. The pack dynamics emphasized in modern werewolf fiction create symbolism around community, belonging, and the balance between individual freedom and group loyalty. Werewolf packs in contemporary stories often function as surrogate families, providing the belonging and acceptance that the outside world denies to these creatures. The pack offers protection and understanding but also demands obedience and subordination to the alpha, creating tension between the individual and the collective. This reflects broader human experiences of joining groups and communities, where membership provides benefits but also requires conformity and sacrifice of complete individual autonomy. The pack hierarchy mirrors social power structures in human communities, allowing stories to explore questions about leadership, authority, and rebellion in ways that might be more difficult in purely realistic fiction. The relationship between werewolves and sexuality has been explored extensively in modern interpretations, with the transformation often carrying sexual symbolism and werewolf characters frequently being portrayed as intensely sexual beings. The loss of control during transformation parallels loss of control in sexual passion, while the enhanced senses and physical power of the werewolf form suggest heightened experience and capability. The monthly cycle of transformation for many werewolves parallels menstrual cycles, creating a specifically gendered reading of lycanthropy that some feminist critics have explored in depth. The idea that werewolves mate for life, common in paranormal romance fiction, creates romantic symbolism around permanent bonding and absolute loyalty that appeals to certain relationship fantasies. The dangerous attractive werewolf who represents both threat and protection embodies a specific romantic archetype with complicated psychological dimensions that tap into desires and fears about sexuality and partnership. The enduring popularity of werewolf stories across changing times and cultures demonstrates that the symbolism remains potent and relevant, that each generation finds new meanings in the ancient legend of humans who become beasts. Whether interpreted as externalization of inner darkness, as commentary on the relationship between civilization and nature, as metaphor for alienation and hidden identity, or as vehicle for exploring transformation and change, the werewolf continues to speak to fundamental aspects of human experience. The flexibility of the symbol, its ability to carry multiple meanings simultaneously, and to be adapted for different cultural contexts and purposes, ensures that werewolf legends will continue evolving and remaining relevant for future generations just as they have persisted and adapted throughout the past. The werewolf has survived the transition from belief to legend to entertainment, from genuine fear to fictional thrill, from campfire story to multimedia franchise. What began as an attempt by ancient peoples to make sense of predation and violence, to understand the savage impulses that humans were capable of despite their civilized pretensions, has become one of the most recognizable and enduring figures in global popular culture. The werewolf walks through thousands of stories, appears in countless films and television shows, features in video games and comic books and novels, always recognizable despite endless variations and reinterpretations. The core elements remain constant even as details change. The human who becomes beast, the loss of control, the transformation between forms, the danger and the tragedy intertwined in the cursed existence of the lycanthrope. The modern world has no place for literal werewolves, no room for belief in supernatural transformation in an age of science and rational explanation. Yet the werewolf persists not as a creature that people fear encountering in physical reality, but as a story that people continue finding compelling and meaningful. The questions that werewolf legends explore remain relevant. The anxieties they express about human nature and the thin line between civilization and savagery have not been resolved by modernity or technology. We still wonder about our own capacity for violence, still fear losing control, still struggle with the tension between social demands and individual desires, still feel alienated and different in ways that must be hidden to fit into dominant society. The werewolf gives form to these concerns, makes them tangible and dramatic, allows us to explore them safely through fiction in ways that might be too threatening if addressed directly. Each generation reinterprets the werewolf for its own time, emphasizing the aspects of the legend that speak most directly to contemporary concerns, while preserving enough traditional elements to maintain connection to the story's long history. Victorian werewolf fiction explored the gap between respectable appearance and hidden desires, reflecting the era's obsession with propriety and reputation. Mid-20th century werewolf films emerged during periods of war and social change, when violence seemed to lurk everywhere and the breakdown of civilization felt threatening and immediate. Modern urban fantasy werewolf stories often focus on themes of community and belonging, of finding your people and your place in a fragmented world where traditional social structures have weakened. Paranormal romance werewolves embody fantasies about passionate, devoted partners who are dangerous to everyone except their chosen mate, reflecting contemporary desires for relationships that are both exciting and absolutely secure. Each of these interpretations adds to the accumulated tradition, while transforming it to address the specific needs and interests of its audience. The werewolf has also become a lens through which to examine real-world issues and concerns that might be difficult to address directly. Stories about werewolves facing persecution and hiding their nature have been read as allegories for various forms of oppression and marginalization, allowing authors to explore issues of prejudice and othering in fantastical contexts that create critical distance while maintaining emotional impact. Environmental werewolf stories that present lycanthropes as defenders of nature against human destruction tap into concerns about ecological crisis and humanity's destructive relationship with the natural world. Werewolf stories about infection and transmission gained new resonance during the AIDS crisis and again during recent pandemic experiences, as people grappled with diseases that spread through contact and transformed or killed those infected. The flexibility of the werewolf as metaphor means that the legend can be adapted to address almost any situation where transformation, loss of control, hidden nature, or the division between civilized and savage becomes relevant. The commercial success of werewolf stories across multiple media has ensured that new werewolf content will continue being produced as long as audiences remain interested and willing to consume these stories. Publishers commission werewolf novels, studios greenlight werewolf films and television series. Game developers create werewolf games, all because market research shows that audiences want these stories and will pay for them. This economic reality means that the werewolf legend is self-sustaining in contemporary culture, that it will continue evolving and being reinterpreted because doing so remains profitable. While this commercial dimension might seem to cheapen or corrupt the authentic folkloric tradition, it actually ensures the legend's survival in forms accessible to modern audiences who might never encounter traditional folklore, but who engage regularly with popular entertainment media. Academic study of werewolf legends continues as well, with folklorists, historians, anthropologists, psychologists, and literary scholars all finding rich material in the tradition's long history and contemporary manifestations. These scholars analyze what werewolf legends reveal about the cultures that create and maintain them, about human psychology and the construction of identity, about how folklore transforms over time and adapts to new contexts. The scholarly attention given to werewolf legends validates their cultural importance, treats them as worthy subjects for serious intellectual inquiry rather than merely disposable entertainment. This academic legitimacy in turn influences how creators approach werewolf stories, as writers and filmmakers engage with scholarly interpretations and incorporate them into new works, creating a dialogue between academic analysis and popular culture production. The global reach of modern media has spread werewolf legends far beyond their European origins, introducing the concept to cultures that had no traditional werewolf folklore of their own. Japanese manga and anime have embraced werewolf characters, blending them with indigenous Japanese supernatural traditions to create hybrid mythologies. Indian films have featured werewolves, adapting the European legend to South Asian contexts and sensibilities. Latin American telenovelas have incorporated werewolf storylines, drawing on both European werewolf traditions and indigenous American shapeshifter legends to create distinctively regional variations. This globalization of werewolf mythology demonstrates how folklore traditions can spread and adapt across cultural boundaries, how a legend born in one context can be successfully transplanted to very different settings by emphasizing the universal human concerns that underlie the specific cultural expression. The werewolf has become such a fundamental part of cultural literacy in the modern world that references to werewolves and lycanthropy appear constantly in contexts far removed from actual werewolf stories. People use werewolf metaphors in everyday conversation without necessarily thinking about the legendary creature, speaking of someone's hidden nature or savage behavior as their inner wolf, or describing transformative experiences as turning into something else entirely. The full moon is still associated with strange behavior and chaos, partly because of the cultural saturation of werewolf imagery linking lunar cycles to transformation and madness. Silver bullets have become a general metaphor for the perfect solution to a difficult problem because of the werewolf legend's establishment of silver as the one substance that can kill these creatures. These linguistic and conceptual traces demonstrate how deeply werewolf mythology has penetrated contemporary culture, how thoroughly it has been absorbed into the basic framework through which we understand and describe the world. As we move further into the 21st century, the werewolf shows no signs of fading from popular consciousness or cultural relevance. New technologies will enable new ways of depicting transformation and telling werewolf stories, with virtual reality potentially allowing people to experience lycanthropy from the inside in unprecedented ways. Genetic engineering and biotech developments may inspire new interpretations of werewolf mythology that frame lycanthropy in terms of controlled mutation or engineered transformation rather than supernatural curse. Climate change and ecological collapse might make werewolf stories emphasizing humanity's connection to nature and the consequences of severing those connections particularly resonant. The specific forms that werewolf stories take will change, but the underlying legend will persist because it addresses aspects of human experience and human nature that remain constant despite all superficial changes in technology and society. The werewolf began as an attempt to explain violence and predation, to make sense of the beast within civilized humans, to create a framework for understanding transformation and loss of control. Thousands of years later, these concerns remain as pressing as ever, the questions as urgent, the fears as real. We have learned that people cannot literally transform into wolves, that lycanthropy is mental illness or metaphor rather than physical reality. Yet the werewolf persists in our collective imagination because we still need the story that it tells. We still need to confront our own capacity for savagery, still need to explore what it means to lose control, still need to examine the boundary between human and animal, civilization and wilderness, the self we present to the world and the darker self that lurks beneath. The werewolf gives us a way to do this, a vehicle for examining these uncomfortable truths through the safety of fiction and legend. As long as humans remain torn between civilized aspirations and animal impulses, as long as we fear the darkness within ourselves and wonder how close we are to the beast, the werewolf will continue to haunt our stories and our dreams, an eternal reminder that we are never as far from savagery as we like to believe, that the moon will rise and the transformation will begin again.